It's common ground in the gender wars that are currently raging, particularly on TikTok, but across social media. I think it's common ground that men are suffering. The high suicide rates, high incarceration rates, the violence perpetrated by and against men, the very high depression rates and other mental health issues that are assailing men. And we've seen endless stats and studies about the loneliness of men, and that, how bad things are for single men. We see the rise of an incel culture that is inherently misogynistic and very often leads to violence and social distress. But the real question where the divide starts is, why is this happening? And then more importantly, what do you do about it? How do you do it? How do you solve this problem? How do you make men's lives better? Because again, I think it's common ground that if men's lives improve, if we can reduce all of these factors that indicate how unsatisfactory men's lives are, then everybody's life will improve. And particularly at the top of the intersectional tree for white men, white Western men, which is the world that I know, that if we can solve this particular dilemma, we also improve life for women, minorities, Black, Indigenous, and other people of color, LGBTQI plus people, trans people, all of these other issues that cascade down from the dissatisfaction, the distress, the depression, the confusion of men at the top of this intersectional hierarchy under patriarchy. So I think what I'd like to say is the why. And of course, I know that this is complex, but I think that there are several obvious factors here. The first being the failure to adapt to a changing world, to see the world and the way it's developing rushing past them and being confused about their place in the world because they've been so used to privilege and entitlement for decades, if not hundreds of years. And so when that is questioned, when accountability enters the picture, it can be distressing and confusing. Plus the traditional male or masculine roles, as they've often been trotted out, of providing and protecting have been questioned as well, because for obvious reasons to do with the economy and patriarchy and capitalism, it's becoming harder and harder and harder to be a provider, a satisfactory provider. And so many men are being left behind economically. And the other aspect of protection, the blindingly obvious point that's been circulating recently, but I think is distressing men, is protection from who? And the obvious answer every time is from other men. And so this role of providing and protecting is strongly questioned. And all of these factors put together mean that men are in a state of transition, and that is being resisted by many, many men who are clinging on to the past and past values to try and retain their sense of place in the world. And the accountability issue is really, really cascading down from the very top of a pyramid that people kind of knew existed but didn't realize could be questioned. So the likes of Harvey Weinstein, the likes of the Me Too movement that arose from him being held accountable, the Jeffrey Epsteins of this world who felt that they were inviolable, untouchable, suddenly becoming very much touchable, not a word I should have used, but held accountable for their actions, the cascade down to ordinary men, of being held accountable for how you turn up in long-term relationships, how you treat women, how you treat Black, Indigenous, and other people of color, how you treat people who don't conform to your gender binaries as a cishet man, non-binary, LGBTQI people, transgender people. We're totally confused by how the world around us is changing with a rapidity that appears to leave us behind. And in particular, I think it is reasonably well understood now that challenges to privilege or the loss of privileges actually looks like oppression. And so men's entitlement and basic privilege, male privilege in life, and if you deny it, you're a misogynistic dick. It exists. That privilege, when it's questioned and you're held accountable for the exercise of that privilege, it feels like you're now being oppressed, to the point where certain people are up there in the world, your Matt Walsh's, your Ben Shapiro's, your Jordan Petersons and others, saying that, white cishet males are the most oppressed class in the world. Now, that's utterly ludicrous. It's damaging horseshit. But I can see where it comes from, because that position of entitlement and privilege has been severely undermined by the world in recent decades. And the world changing around these men is undesirable to them because it feels like oppression. It's not. It's just the loss of advantage, the loss of privilege. And it's still 100% the case that men, and in particular white men, still occupy that top spot in the patriarchal hierarchy in late capitalist society. In most of the world, it is still very much a man's world. But for ordinary men, there's this constant questioning, this constant being held accountable, this constant pressure, as they see it, to provide and protect in circumstances where that's becoming really, really difficult. And so that, I think, is the what. I think, of course, there are other factors. The lack of mental health provision, the lack of, as they see it, safe spaces for men to deal with these issues. I get all of that. And I think that the real kind of nub of the divide on social media is about the what do we do about this and how do we do it. And I started giving this a lot of thought because those of you who follow me on TikTok will know that I got into a spat with a particular commenter who clearly was a young guy who'd read a little bit, held himself out as a feminist ally, anti-racist, anti-patriarchal guy, but was actually displaying all the behaviors of a patriarchal, toxic male. He didn't say much about race, so I can't assume that his anti-racism was performative. But he had a gigantic cognitive dissonance between his actual behavior and words in the comments and his desperation to defend himself and what he was calling himself. And I made several TikToks about this. But it did make me think, because his basic premise from the start was that toxic masculinity and men in general should be treated, or that the right way to approach this was to treat these men with compassion and pity, to understand where they were coming from and hold out an olive branch and help them move forward in compassion, empathy, and pity. And the response from women was no. They've had decades to recognize and do something about toxic masculinity, and coddling that narrative that men kind of can't help where they are was not the right approach. Now, I could see that it's arguable. I happen to agree that compassion it's possible to have compassion and not act from pity, because pity, most of these men would see and compassion as feminine attributes, feminine feelings, and therefore would not welcome it because they have reached a stage of being so anti-feminist and so misogynistic in their fear and retreat that displaying those feminine qualities towards them would, I think, feel insulting and not meeting them in their masculinity, in their manhood. But that's not the only reason why that's not the right approach, because the trouble with this idea of compassion and pity is that it continues the narrative that these men's positions are both justified and that it is other people's labor, work, and pity and compassion that is necessary to pull them into a more harmonious life with everybody else, with women, with minorities, with underrepresented or non-gender binary people. And this in my view is a mistake. because actually there's more than enough information out there for these men to both identify where they might be going wrong and what to do about that, how to change their behavior. It's not up to the oppressed to bring their oppressor along. It is up to the oppressor, this group at the top of the patriarchal hierarchy, to sort themselves out by recognizing the harm that they are causing, as well as the harm that they're receiving. There's no doubt that patriarchy hurts everyone. There's no doubt about that. But it is up to the people at the top of this pyramid to recognize the harm that they're causing and the harm that they're receiving, and to address that. They are in prime position. They are in pole position to deal with this. And there's more than enough material and resources out there for them to sort this problem on for themselves through their research. It is not up to women to solve this problem. It is not up to oppressed minorities to solve this problem. It is up to men to solve this problem. So if they want safe spaces, they've got to create them. But they can't just be echo chambers for misogynistic bullshit. They have to genuinely be places where men are held accountable in a safe environment and taught by other men how to get out of the situation that they're in, how to become better, how to integrate into the new world in which they feel anomalous, right? It is also up to men to ensure that mental health services available to men are enhanced and funded. And I know that's difficult, and I know that's difficult because women have had to do it for decades. They are the ones that created women's shelters, that created support and solidarity in community. One of the great problems of patriarchal late-stage capitalism is the loss of community. And that isn't just in the neighborhood where you live, but also that sense of solidarity that men had in an age when it was easier to understand and perform your role as provider and protector. Now that that has changed, we've lost that sense, particularly white men, of community. And it is up to us to recreate that and to campaign for the things that we need that help us, and by helping us as men, help the rest of society, because we still occupy that top spot in the hierarchy. So our healing results in everyone's healing, okay? Our compassion, our pity for ourselves and our fellows, and what we do about that is the solution to a shitload of problems lower down that hierarchy, okay? And that's why it's up to men to solve these problems and not women. And I think finally, the point I'd like to make is that us taking responsibility and being accountable and changing our behavior will be very, very healing, and not just to us, but to the rest of the world, as I've said, but will also result, and I think this is the key, in more nourishing relationships, better understanding between the genders, better understanding between the races, which means that our lives improve because we have access to more health and happiness and joy and community, because we are taking up our rightful role in those communities. We are becoming the people other people wish to be with. And at the moment, we, broadly speaking, stick out like sore thumbs in a world that's changing, where we appear to be the blockages to that change. Why don't we become part of the change? And that's the point I wanted to make, but impossible in the 3 minutes allotted to us by the glories of TikTok. So here we are on YouTube. I'd love to know what you think about what I've had to say.